Our next panelist is Daniel Johnson. Daniel earned a PhD from the University of Alberta this year. He has worked and volunteered in Edmonton's inner city for over 6 years. Since 2012, he has worked full-time as a frontline outreach worker in downtown Edmonton. He's taught at Muskegee's Cultural College and in the Faculty of Native Studies at the University of Alberta, where he presently teaches courses on community engagement and the Community Service Learning Program. With degrees from the University of Toronto and McGill University, he has published widely in peer-reviewed journals and the Globe and Mail, and has presented his research at international conferences as well as the UNC Chapel Hill and Yale University. He is currently working on a book on settler colonialism in Edmonton. You can follow him on Twitter at AnarchistPhD. Welcome.
Good morning. It's really an honor to be here. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 6 territory, and most specifically that we are on what was and what should still be the Papas Chase Reserve. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. The structural factors that I would like to examine today are about who has a right to inhabit space in Edmonton, about whose aspirations on this land are preeminent. Patrick Wolfe provides a definition of settler colonialism that has become popular in Indigenous studies in recent years. For Wolfe, settler colonialism involves the replacement of Indigenous people with settlers. This process is sustained and institutional, and it is an ongoing structure of domination, not a series of distinct events. A defining characteristic of settler colonialism is what Wolfe calls the logic of elimination. Wolfe writes, "The primary motive for elimination is not race, but access to territory. Territoriality is settler colonialism's specific, irreducible element. Thus, the goal of settler colonizers is the elimination of Indigenous peoples in order to gain access to and become the majority occupiers of Indigenous peoples' territories. Settler colonialism destroys to replace." Now, under the terms of Treaty 6, which was negotiated by Plains Indigenous bands and the Crown in 1876, the Crown is obligated to provide reserve land, ongoing annuity payments, access to health care and medicine, education, and assistance in times of pestilence or famine. As the text of Treaty 6 reads, "They are to count upon and receive from Her Majesty's bounty and benevolence." The 2012 Edmonton homeless count recorded 2,174 homeless citizens. Many frontline workers believe this number is low. According to the count, Aboriginal people make up 46% of Edmonton's homeless community, a number that has been increasing since 1999. The 2006 census identified 5% of the city's total population as Aboriginal. Those who should have received the Queen's bounty and benevolence make up nearly half of Edmonton's homeless community. What I hope to illustrate in this presentation is how this situation was created in ways that are systemic, sustained, and planned, that Edmonton is indeed built on settler colonialism. The Government of Alberta's aspirational document to end homelessness in 10 years unintentionally acknowledges settler colonialism, and it's true that the 10-year plan barely acknowledges Indigenous people. As Alberta has grown, so has the scope of homelessness. It didn't occur overnight. Exactly. The growth of Alberta, the province, established in 1905, has occurred at the expense of the Indigenous nations who have called the region home for at least 8,000 years. At least 46% of Edmonton's homeless citizens are identified as Aboriginal. The fiscal, social, and policy decisions that created this reality are rooted in the systematic theft and occupation of Indigenous territories by settler colonizers. Alberta, the province, is indeed built on the homelessness of Indigenous peoples through dispossession and disenfranchisement, removal and replacement. Alberta's 10-year plan policy document individualizes homelessness, identifying factors like mental and physical illness or addictions and economic poverty as among the possible root causes. But what if the underlying factors are more systemic, like the invasion of settlers, broken treaties, the systematic displacement of Indigenous collectivities, racist and racialized laws like the Indian Act, and the occupation of treaty territories by non-Indigenous peoples? What if the underlying factor is us? Chief Papas-Chase adhered to Treaty 6 in 1877 at Fort Edmonton, choosing to have his People's Treaty Reserve located south of the fort in what covers much of present-day South Edmonton. Throughout the 1870s and 80s, local citizens, organized by businessman and politician Frank Oliver, advocated for the dismemberment and removal of the Papas-Chase band from their treaty territory, such that the valuable land was eventually sold to third parties. In January 1883, several chiefs from the Edmonton area, including Papas-Chase, Bobtail, Sampson, and Ermineskin, wrote a letter to Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, and ironically this was published in Frank Oliver's newspaper, the Edmonton Bulletin, beside a story, "Drunken Indians made considerable noise in the brush near the Indian office on Friday night of last week." But Oliver reprinted the chief's letter. The chiefs wrote, "We are reduced to the lowest stage of poverty. We were once a proud and independent people, and now we are mendicants at the door of every white man in the country. Our young women are reduced by starvation to become prostitutes to the white man for a living, a thing unheard of before amongst ourselves." The chiefs were making a direct link between Crown breaches of Treaty 6 and their economic poverty. I know many homeless people today who identify as descendants of the Papas-Chase band. Now, through the late 1930s, the City Police Department, the local Board of Health, and City Council were alerted to groups of Indigenous people camped in the area of Stony Plain Road and 140th Street. Archival records of the time indicate that most of those camping in the area were not status Indians, leading me to believe that they were likely descendants of those discharged from treaty during the Half-Breed Scrip Commission of 1885 and 1886. As such, they had no reserve on which to live. The city's chief health inspector reported that there were families, men and women with up to 5 children, pregnant women, and a 79-year-old woman with her daughter and her 1-year-old child. Constable Dunlop of the city police noted in a report that he had, quote, "told these people that they would have to move away from this location. They promised to do this immediately." Chief Constable A.G. Shute reported that the elderly woman, quote, "although an Indian by birth, she is not entitled to treaty money, her people having surrendered their treaty rights. The woman was clearly descended from one of the bands whose members were coerced or chose to accept scrip amidst the starvation period of the mid-1880s. Shute concluded, quote, "it would appear to be necessary to remove these people from the city." Thus, the official response was the removal and further displacement of Indigenous people who had nowhere else to go and who were doing their best to survive despite the condition theirs and their ancestors' prior displacements had brought. Chief Constable Shute also noted, "one of the more intelligent of the men informed me that there are about 10,000 homeless half-breeds in Alberta." People camping in that area in the late 1930s had surnames that are familiar to us: Gladue, Bernard, Belcourt, Paul, Cunningham. I can't help but wonder both if their parents had been forced off their treaty lands and if their descendants are among our Housing First clients today, many of whom have the same last names. But the people continued living in shacks and tents in that area. In a letter dated October 3rd, 1939, the secretary of the Jasper Place Community League wrote to the Edmonton Health Board. This is using the language of the day. "At the annual meeting of the Jasper Place Community League held on October 2nd, I was instructed to write you protesting the colony of half-breed squatters located north of Stony Plain Road on 142nd Street. We understand that there are at least 150 breeds living in old boxcars and tents around the old CN right-of-way on 105th Avenue. We also wish to protest against these half-breeds being allowed to ride the bus carrying bags of garbage picked up on the city lanes." Looking back, we can firmly situate the rhetoric that demanded the removal of these Indigenous people within the logic of settler colonialism. They needed to be replaced, regardless of the fact that they were trying to survive and thrive as best they could. In the 1930s, the local community league was calling for the removal of Indigenous peoples who were collecting bottles and cloth for sale, in much the same way as today's supportive housing projects are debated by the media and community members in places like Terwilliger Town in 2013 and the Macaulay Community League in 2012. Published in 1976, Thrasher Skid Row Eskimo by Inuvialuit writer Anthony Apokark Thrasher documents the author's time living on the streets, mostly in Edmonton and Calgary in the late 1950s until the late 1960s. Thrasher's life ended on the streets of Edmonton in 1989 when he was found lying in a downtown parking lot. Thrasher was located to Edmonton in 1957 as part of a government work training program. Now, shortly after arriving in the city, Thrasher and his friends began to explore the neighborhood around the Alberta Hotel, which is now rebuilt just meters from its original location at Jasper Avenue and 98th Street. Now, Thrasher documents several instances of police brutality, not only on the streets, but in police vehicles and holding cells. In Edmonton, Thrasher recalls a violent encounter with police the same day he was released from the drunk tank. He writes, "Out on the street later, I met two policemen. One told me to beat it, but I told them I wasn't drunk. They were young cops. They put the handcuffs on me and threw me hard, head first, into the paddy wagon. One of them got in with me. My arms were fastened behind my back with the iron cuffs. He put his foot on my back and forced my arms up to my neck. I howled with pain, but the policemen were laughing. Something snapped in my right arm, also in my head. I blacked out." Now, Thrasher's story bridges the policing strategy we saw in the 1930s, removal and relocation, with added violence in the 50s and 60s. However, his story of being driven around in crowded paddy wagons and experiencing police violence because of his homelessness have sickening parallels in Edmonton today. I only have a few minutes left, so I will just sort of summarize. Some of you might remember, and I want to acknowledge that this story was actually broken by the then Edmonton Street News, now the Alberta Street News, before the mainstream media caught on. What was called the Sweatbox incident, when 9 homeless people, many of whom were Indigenous, were picked up against their will by the Edmonton Police Service in 2005. They were driven around in a paddy wagon for a couple of hours and dropped off in a North Edmonton neighborhood. "It was like we were in a sauna," the late Diane Wood told CTV. The late Diane Wood and Christopher Robillard were speaking out in 2007 because their complaint with the EPS was stalled for 18 months without being investigated. After a year-long investigation, the RCMP announced in June 2008 that no criminal charges would be laid against the officers involved. In 2010, Edmonton Police decided 3 officers would face an internal hearing. 2 were found guilty in November 2010, while the other was cleared because he was deemed to be only riding along in the police vehicle at the time, just following orders. The presiding officer at the internal disciplinary hearing rejected the accusation that the officer's actions were racially motivated. In fact, he claimed that the officers had a genuine concern for the well-being of the people the officers transported that day. The late Diane Wood told the Edmonton Journal, "We weren't drunk, we weren't doing anything, we're just homeless." So how does this research contribute to ending homelessness? I've tried to illustrate the ongoing displacement of Indigenous peoples in Edmonton since 1877, while highlighting the systemic factors that created the conditions of contemporary Indigenous homelessness: breaches of Treaty 6, organized campaigns for Indigenous removals by Edmonton's politicians, citizens groups, and community leagues, and the role of the city's police in coercing homeless people to move by infringing on their Indigenous and basic human rights. Homelessness isn't just a matter of individual economic poverty or mental illness or addiction. Every conversation about policies and research about homelessness must be grounded in an analysis of settler colonialism. This means forgetting the NIMBY idea. Not in my backyard discourses are rooted more in deeply held beliefs about who has the right to use land. You can see John Locke in 1670 as a starting point for this, than simple snobbishness. We must understand homelessness, particularly Indigenous homelessness, as ongoing structural and systemic colonialism, which is endorsed by governments and sustained by citizens. Homelessness is also rhetorical. In Edmonton, Indigenous peoples are home. Even people who do not have houses are still emphatically at home. One person's distressed neighborhood is another's ancestral territory. Your definition of chaos may be someone else's method of coping, say, with a colonial onslaught. How does our discourse reinforce and perpetuate homelessness? What is needed and what is missing from 10-year plans to end homelessness like the province of Alberta's or city of Edmonton's is a sustained analysis of settler colonialism as a root cause of homelessness. Ending homelessness will only result from a sustained movement toward decolonization. I wanted to show this slide that's reproduced from a drawing by Fine Day that's included in David Mandelbaum's book, The Plains Cree. I just wanted to leave with this note that perhaps housing policies and programs could really reflect Indigenous epistemologies. This diagram of a Cree summer camp circle circa 1870 from a sketch drawn by Fine Day illustrates the placement of hundreds of teepees around the outer circle organized by geopolitical designations, like the House people, River people, and Prairie people. Inside the circle are tents belonging to societies and prominent chiefs like Sweetgrass and Big Bear. Though this was a seasonal configuration, it may reflect a model for housing today, one that reinforces communal ties, is flexible in accommodating people from different communities, is centered around traditional leadership, and honors Indigenous spiritualities, governance, aesthetics, and life ways. Thank you.